The story of the Forgotten Realms is fairly complicated, and it goes back tens of thousands of years, with civilizations that rise and fall, with nations that conquer others, epic magic spells that fundamentally change the world as we know it, and heroes that go down in legend for all time. This is a continuation of our series on our timeline of the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and we have gone from the year minus 35,000 DR to minus 3,000 DR into the era that we call the Age of Humanity. We are reaching the end, fellas. There is just not a lot left. If you're interested in understanding the series and where we started, then I highly recommend watching this video right here first, and then following the releases sequentially up until this one, with perhaps the exception of the half-elf videos, which would be best probably to watch last, since they do contain some pretty good information on demographics of the world, which might be fun to see now that you're gonna have the context as to why the demographics of Faerun look the way they do. But yeah, this is it, the video that will finally take us to around 500 years before the present day. So the world as you know it in Dungeons and Dragons is based on what happens on this video. So stay tuned and get ready, because there's a lot of crazy stuff that is going to happen. But before we get into it, this video is brought to you by HelloFresh, ingredients and recipes delivered right onto your door for healthy living. No need to go to the grocery store anymore, no need to even think about what is it really that you're going to make. HelloFresh has you covered. This is a food delivery subscription, but we're not talking fast food or microwavable food. We're talking fresh produce, fresh meats, and everything that you need for you to be able to cook the food yourself at home. At HelloFresh.com, you get to pick from a long list of different meals, which refreshes every week, and you can customize your search based on any dietary restriction, such as if you're interested in low-fat options, fish, vegetarian, or even meals that don't take too much time to prep. When you select your options, you will be delivered the fresh ingredients, including all of the seasonings and sauces, and of course the recipe, at home so that you can make the meal fresh yourself. Again, no fast food, no microwavable food here. This is fresh grocery delivered to you with perfectly proportioned ingredients and recipes, just so that you can make the meal and leave no waste behind. This saves you on time so that you don't have to go grocery shopping. It saves you on money so that you're getting exactly what you need and you don't have to be driving, paying for gas, or getting things that you frankly just don't need. And my personal favorite thing, it helps you get cooking. Cooking is just frankly better than getting takeout. We all know this. It's cheaper, it's healthier, and it promotes better habits. And you can ask like 99% of society here on this one. Once you start cooking and you develop that habit, you are far better off. Plus, everyone likes a partner that can cook. Use my link or go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGREXJune16 to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. Once you click, my description will live update to count up the purchases. Remember, fellas, use my code and get a ton of free meals with your subscription. POGREXJune16. Don't miss it. Thank you, HelloFresh, for sponsoring us here, and now, back to the video. At the beginning of time, when the world was still encased in ice, there was a reason why it was in ice in the first place. The world prior had been a battle zone for gods and primordials, and in this battle of mythical proportions, legends say that a powerful serpent-like primordial devoured the sun and ushered an age of darkness and coldness that enveloped the world. Whether it was true or not is far beyond mortals to ever discover, and of course gods are silent about such matters, but what is true is that this primordial was betrayed by another primordial, one who tricked it and got it imprisoned in a magically sealed gate far up in a volcano in the lands of Chult, right here. In recompense for betraying its ally, the gods granted this primordial dominion over this land, provided of course that he protected it and safeguarded the prison of this snake-like monstrous being. The betrayer is called Ubtao, or Ubtao the Betrayer as he has been called, and the snake Dendar the Night Serpent, or perhaps the World Serpent, the very same one that blessed the original Serox at the beginning of time. Now, it is hard to tell whether this Dendar the Night Serpent is the very same snake entity that blessed the Serox, because snakes are known to shed their skin over time and take on multiple personalities, which is ironically what ended up destroying the reign of the Serox in the first place. But I digress. The land of Cholt layered empty for millennia, save for the minions of Uptau, who we named the Coatls, who fight day and night against the minions of the Serpent, the UNT, that dominate the forgotten and dilapidated old capitals of the Serox to the east of the peninsula. With the battles weakening the Coatls, Uptau searched for more who would answer his call, and so he sent many of his helpers out onto the continents far beyond, specifically the unknown lands to the west, which frankly, we don't really know anything about. We haven't really been told much about these lands in the lore. The year is minus 2890R. The Coatl messengers spread out the message of Uptau onto these forgotten lands and found the Tabaxi, the Eshowi, and the Tinguth human tribes. Now, you need to understand that these are not like actual Tabaxis, as in, these are not the leopard humanoid creatures that you might be familiar with. These are just normal, but relatively primitive humans. See, when these humans eventually made their way onto Faerun, they happened to be wearing tiger and leopard-like hide skin. And so when the human races of Faerun got to know them and called them Tabaxi, as that was their name, they also ended up calling the actual animal creature Tabaxis because of the humans. So in reality, it is these guys who are actually misnamed. A little confusing, but yeah. Anyways, these human tribes had their own beliefs and followed their own god, though it would be probably more apt to say that they were intimidated by their own god, who presumably abused them. Again, not much is known about this god that they revered, but we know that its name was Ulorobo. Now, this god had demigod-like children that these tribes used to interact with, one of which was a Tarask, who they called a child of Ulorobo. The story says that this Tarask was actually intelligent and actually spearheaded a massive war against the Serox of Mershulk tens of thousands of years ago. So all of the Tabaxi, and presumably even multiple Tarasks, fought the Serox of Mershulk and actually won. Again, keep in mind that the Serox at this point in time basically dominated almost the entire planet. So winning against the most powerful empire that has presumably ever existed was huge. Though something happened to this demigod main Tarask, which turned it angry and hateful. In its hatred, it ended up devouring a bunch of the other demigods and then set out to sleep, only to awake every 1,000 years. The Tabaxi would basically be destroyed almost every time by the awakening Tarask, and it became something of a religion to them, something that would happen every 1,000 years, until Uptau blessed a Tabaxi known as Uyai with chosen power. See, a chosen is basically a mortal that has been blessed with divine power, usually in order for that mortal to perform tasks designated by that god. So imagine something of a mortal right hand for a god. Well, with one punch, Uyai destroyed the Tarask. Then, when all of the Tabaxi and the other tribes saw the power of Uptau, they ended up following the Coatls on 300 canoes over to Cholt, where they would end up becoming the protectors and guardians of both the land and also the seals that would chain Dendar onto that big volcano. Uptau then built for them the holy city of Mesro, and then created more chosen in order to become demigod rulers of that city. Eventually, Uptau would end up abandoning the city, claiming that he grew tired of the petty squabbles and all that they would ask of him, and so he would separate himself into multiple animal essences that would then roam Cholt independently of each other as spirit animals. But then a massive civil war would end up destroying the city, as the Tabaxi and the Eshowi would fight one another in the year minus 137 DR. In order to save the city, one of the chosen called Rasnasi summoned a bunch of undead, which did help save the city, but resulted in his banishment for the taboo of using the dead. Even to this day, all of those undead that he created on this great war still roam the jungles of Sheol to this day. So the jungles are just chock full of undead, including dinosaur undeads and many other types of creatures. This civil war severely weakened the humans of the region, allowing then for the overpopulation of the Bachiri goblins that also lived in the region, creating one of the most goblin-populated locations actually in the world, again, even today. However, throughout the years before the weakening, the power of Mesro and the further migration of more humans moving south from Kalanshan would end up weakening the UNT on the east, at least enough to push them onto this very small section of land. But yeah, all of those human races that came from this unknown continent to the west ended up forming the culture and races that we now recognize as Cholton that live on this continent. Now, moving on onto the open world, this particular age is when elves and dwarves really do end up basically almost disappearing, and of course, the humans dominating. As we start this age, we have the greatest empire of the dwarves called Xanatar, basically in shambles. Most of their populace has migrated outwards to form other kingdoms, and the upper section of Xanatar, which was located right here north of Kalansham, at this point has been completely taken by Kalansham. They basically had a war with Kalansham, and Kalansham ended up winning. Now, out of these kingdoms that sprouted out from Xanatar, Ogram has basically collapsed thanks to disease and monsters such as bugbears and lizardfolk. Hong Danar collapsed onto itself as it was a coastal city that was founded right here, and it is said that the dwarves grew mad from the ocean. They are creatures of stone after all, and so the ocean did not sit them well at all, and so they ended up getting overtaken by giants and trolls over time. Garagaur was another kingdom that was completely destroyed by orcs. Besselmer right here was constructed and destroyed merely a few thousand years later by humanoids and giants. And these are just like the mini-kingdoms that sprawled out of Xanatar that are already destroyed before we even start this age. More, of course, would go down as the age of humanity would start unfolding, including the very center of Xanatar underground. See, Deep Xanatar, as it was called, under the area that we know as Kalamshan, would be absolutely obliterated by no one else but the Duragar during the year minus 1800 DR. See, the Duragar had been unstoppable until now. They founded their big city of Gracklstug in minus 3717 DR, called the City of Blades. And only 400 years later, they formed the mini-empire called the Deep Kingdom, with, of course, Gracklstug as its centerpiece. 50 years before the fall of Xanatar, the Duragar started this massive crusade of expansion and war, leadered by their queen Duera, and they just ended up basically dominating most of the middle and upper Underdark. They made attacks against the Mindflayers of Orindol, the Drow, and they allegedly even destroyed an entire kingdom of Quaggots, eventually culminating in the utter defeat of the dwarves of Xanatar in a victory so one-sided that the Queen Duera literally was blessed with an apotheosis. She was made into a goddess of the Duragar. And this would be the time when you would say that the Duragar were at their apex. But of course, from an apex, one can only really go down from there. I mean, that's the nature of what an apex literally means. So from then on, they would suffer a slow decline afterwards from this moment onto the present day, as they would basically just slowly hold on to their lands and become more and more isolated, not really expanding and not really accomplishing anything great after that. And of course, as we know, because the Duragar get no feeling of joy or pride in the things that they do, all that they had left now was just that burning hatred of the Xanatar dwarves for leaving them in the hands of the Mindflayers. And so, now with the dwarves defeated, the Duragar would just enter this millennia-long somnolescence, where they would just stagnate up until today. Now, as far as leftover dwarvish realms are concerned, we have the massive Delzone Empire, which is still really strong up in the north, and then we have Amarindar, which is considerably smaller but holds great influence in the area. The Delzone would build incredible fortresses, some of which took decades and decades of construction with thousands of dwarves working day and night. They also built tremendous roads underground which they would use to trade with the humans of Netheril. Trade that would make them very, very rich, as Netheril was incredibly wealthy, as you know. Eventually though, the same thing that took out the Netherese would also take out the Delzone, which were the Farum. When Karsus called his 12th level spell and destroyed all of the floating cities, the Farum continued their onslaught onto the west, entering dwarf lands and also, of course, destroying them, especially so since they had been weakened by constant and just like never-ending orc attacks from the north. However, even though the Delzone Empire collapsed, the beautiful fortresses were left standing, so you can still see them up to this day. They're still controlled by dwarf clans. You can still go there, even though the dwarves in this area tend to be very isolationist. They're quite gorgeous to see. Now, the Amarindar Kingdom would defend itself tremendously against orc onslaughts for many, many generations, but would eventually fall to the orcs much later on at around the year 882, making it the longest lasting shield dwarf kingdom. And so, as it stands now, by the end of the Age of Humanity, no shield dwarf kingdom would remain fully standing, except of course by those lone fortresses with most of the shield dwarf population scattered around now human cities or collected just generally around the Silver Marches. Gold dwarves, on the other hand, would continue to thrive in the Great Rift, the place where it is believed that dwarves originally sprouted from at the beginning of time. If you remember, the place was overtaken by the Dark Elves right after their descent as drow, but the caves all collapsed, killing most of those drow, allowing the dwarves to reclaim it. And so, from that moment, which at the time was minus 7,600 DR, those gold dwarves have been controlling the area basically up until this day. In fact, the Great Rift is the largest concentration of dwarves in the world, and really is the only real kingdom of dwarves that is left. Of course, over time, they would fight both Unther and Yamdath here and there, but they would be effective in safeguarding all of their lands. Now, this is something that I should have mentioned during the founding time, but it escaped me, and now for the sake of completeness, I should probably put it here. There are two main groups of halflings in the world. There are those that were brought here as slaves by the Jin Kalim, who now live on this areas over here, and of course, eventually would migrate upwards onto the Sword Coast. These halflings were brought in at around minus 7,800 DR, but then there are the other halflings, the ones that were natural to this world, which is really a bit unknown exactly when they ended up appearing, but they were basically seen by humans in Lurin as early as minus 6,000 DR. And by then, they had already built all of their towns and cities at around here in this part of the map. These halflings would make this little corner of the world their home, and eventually would grow into their own kingdom, which, by the way, still exists to this day. So if you're wondering what would be the capital of the dwarves and the halflings nowadays, well, here would be the dwarves, and here would be the halflings. It's just that because most of Dungeons & Dragons has focused primarily on the Sword Coast, which is this area, we just don't get to explore some of the other great stuff that exists in the world. We're used to dwarves only having, old ancient fortresses and no big cities of their own. We're used to elves and halflings living in human cities with no home of their own either. But there is a giant dwarvish kingdom, and there is a massive halfling kingdom as well. It's just really interesting that we just don't get the time or the adventures really to explore them. And of course, as we mentioned on our video on Netheril, the gnomes would have a sort of capital as well, which would be right here. Its name is Song Farla. It's a city completely hidden by illusions. Now, there's also technically another one, which is right over here called Lantan, but that wouldn't really start coming together until the present day. And the cities there boast both gnomes and humans, so it's not really like a gnome city as much as it really is a human city that has a lot of gnomes, if that makes any sense. So if you want like a big city that is literally just only gnomes, then Songfarla would be where you would go, though again, very important to note that gnomes are just very, very rare in this world. And even in their biggest city, they're quite small, with only a population of about 12,000 gnomes in there. Now, let's talk about some human kingdoms, because of course, this era gets its name from those. Now, Kalimshan is really the most important one here, other than Netheril, of course, though the story of Kalimshan is very complicated, and most of it is, quite frankly, not really that important to the world at large. By the beginning of this era, Kalimshan becomes a strong empire as they destroy Upper Shanatar. But then, non-stop disaster after disaster falls onto that kingdom. I'm gonna start naming them here, showing you the dates so that you can see just how wild of a history this guy's had. They destroy Upper Shanatar. Then a massive city of beholders is discovered on the Alimir Mountains, who then rapidly invade the city. The beholders end up destroying the eastern fortifications until eventually they are pushed back onto the mountains. Through a series of guild wars, most of the city in Kalimshan is then destroyed and then further rebuilt in the religious style that is now most commonly known as of today. Kalimshan battles a great kingdom of hobgoblins in 4 great battles, and of course, destroys them utterly. Kalimshan becomes huge, encompassing as far north as the Snowflake Mountains, which basically means they take over what is now known today as Kalimshan, Mir, Tethir, and Itzikar. Quote, in retribution for Kalashite adventurers plundering her hoard and slaying one of her brood, Ilvirasalisar, the Rose Dragon, destroys Kalimshan's army, the Caliph's court, the Rayor Bakal, and 2/3 of Kalimport before she settles onto the Bakal's throne and rules the heart of the empire. Much of Kalimport Muzad, the subterranean portion of the city, comes into being as a result of the Red Dragon's attack, as her demands for the city's immediate reconstruction forces builders to simply smooth out the rubble and begin again on top of the old structures. End quote. Dragon Slayers eventually do wound the dragon almost a bit about 100 years later, and an ally Bronze Dragon helps to finish up the job, allowing humans to rule the kingdom once again, though not after bloody fights over the throne. Another 300 years after that, a powerful beholder from the Alimir Mountains called Kiraptir the Blood-Eye organizes multiple beholders on a great daring attack on Kalimshan, which succeeds. The leader, which is now called the Pasha, dies in the attack, and now Kiraptir sits on the throne as beholders rampage through the countryside. Kalimshan is utterly destroyed. Then, almost 30 years later, a religious rebellion is formed, and the priests manage to oust Kiraptir from the throne and fight the beholders out of the cities. The beholder lord successfully escapes then onto the mountains. 120 years later, a massive war begins with the Kingdom of Kalimshan and the Beholder Nations, with Kiraptir being the overlord of those Beholder Nations. The war lasts for 200 years before eventually Kalimshan emerges victorious. Quote, the Pasha's throne at Kalimport now rules from the Sword Coast to Mintar. The increased trade and influence sees Kalimport nearly double in size, to nearly the size of present-day Waterdeep, end quote. 100 years later, a massive intermittent plague hits Kalimport. The first plague, which alone kills nearly half of Kalimport's slaves and forces the Pasha and nobility to hide in their homes for over 2 years. Then, 200 years later, the Night Wars begin, one of the bloodiest wars in the history of Faerun between Kalimshan and the Drow, though it also includes many invasions of the Drow onto other lands. Then, 100 years later, a big Drow attack at night destroys the palace with the entire ruling family within it. The war general controls the city through force as the Drow control sections of the city. Sections of the empire start to become more independent as this is happening, as the populace seeks to leave the kingdom in fears of these night raids. Then, 27 years later, quote, the Drow nearly destroy the town of Keltar in Kalimshan over the course of a 37-hour battle, given their magical superiority and a globe of darkness that they used to surround the city. Kalimport's army arrives after the Drow conquer the city and have shipped more than half of the surviving population into the Underdark as slaves. Although the Kalashites free the town and force the Drow back into the Underdark, more than 3,000 Keltams are never seen again. End quote. Then, 15 years later, quote, large parts of Kalimport are purposefully destroyed to bury the Drow temples and partially subterranean villages. But some remain relatively intact, though buried. Those same wizards who burned the city helped rebuild it and seal off all areas between Kalimport and the Underdark with stone and new buildings. Despite their diligence, the Drow reopened those passages within a decade and re-established their hold on Kalimport below, now nicely protected by the city overhead, end quote. And then finally, 130 years later, the war ends between the Drow and the Kalimshan as the Kalimshan Pasha strikes a secret deal with the matron mothers of the Drow. At the end of the Night Wars, it is estimated that over 75,000 humans were taken by the Drow and enslaved, while over 150,000 humans would die fighting that war, though it is also estimated that the Drow would suffer a similar number of dead. I told you, this history is insane, and we're not even done. 100 years later, a massive fire destroys the entire harbor of Kalimport, which single-handedly obliterates the entire armada of the kingdom, and because the winds push the fire onto the city, Kalimport loses over 70% of its buildings. These are numbers that are given to us. 70% of the buildings in Kalimport were lost. Then 80 years later, another plague hits Kalimport, though this one is even worse than the last one. The Pasha orders the city to be burned in order to destroy the plague, but the fires refuse to burn the city as before, and so literally everyone just abandons the plague city. Priests of Talona, who is the god of poisons, conquers the empty city in order to steal its riches. The only people that live within the city at this point would be escaped slaves, rogues, and necromancers. During this time, the city was actually called the Rogue City. The plague ends about 5 years later, and as it does, the Pasha, quote, re-enters Kalimport and initiates a bloodbath that destroys all those who remain in the city as traitors or plague carriers. Many folk, including the clergy of Talona that ruled the city, survive by fleeing into the Undercity, end quote. 80 years later, Tethir becomes independent from the Kalimshan Empire. Then 50 years later, quote, Kalimshan retakes Kalimaron and Miradma. Able workers, more than a third of the population of both of these towns, are enslaved and brought to Kalimport to work on the new Pasha's palace. The 1,480 warriors among the 5,500 new slaves are all sentenced to the New Gen Arena, where many of them fight to the death against the monsters and each other for the amusement of the masses, end quote. Then lastly, 3 years later, quote, Kalimport increases in population and area to its largest size ever, its true citizens numbering more than 75,000. For the next 8 centuries, Kalimport remains the largest and most frequented port on Faerun's shores. End quote. I am not even done, but I have to go faster because there's just so much going on. I just can't keep doing it like this. So Kalimport is burned again, the Beholder nations resurge again, and more war happens in the kingdom. Tethir is colonized again in a brutal war. 5 massive tidal waves destroy from 1 to 2/3 of every single port city in that kingdom. The death of an important Pasha creates a massive destabilizing wave that creates over 30 new families vying for power, all of which kill each other trying to get to the throne, and all of the cities basically burn again. And eventually, years later, a massive slave revolt causes the empire to sort of collapse at around the year 500 DR, which, by the way, also causes all of Kalimport to burn, and the city is destroyed again. In any case, at this point, Tethir obtains its independence, and at this point for the last time, and a new kingdom is formed in the middle between Tethir and Kalimshan called Amn, which becomes a powerful merchant nation. So here is a bit of a summary of Kalimshan's timeline compared to some of the other topics that we have talked about in our previous videos, so that you can see how that timeline relates to these ones. Now, if you want to ask me how these guys remained so powerful and so relevant after all of these issues, I have no clue. But one thing is for certain, Kalimshan might have conquered the world if it wasn't for all of these calamities. My god. But now, let's move over a bit to the east to the kingdom of Yamdath. If you guys remember, it was these guys who basically curtailed Kalimshan's ambitions to expand onto the east. They were a powerful Psionic kingdom who expanded quite far, or at least they would have wanted to expand even farther, but it was also Kalimshan who blocked their western border, and an entirely new threat was now forming in their east. See, with the fall of the Imaskari Empire, when the Mesopotamian and Egyptian gods finally found their way onto this world and fomented a massive slave rebellion that toppled the empire, the now demigods took their people and formed their own separate kingdoms, with Mulhoran controlled by the Egyptian demigods and Unther controlled by the Mesopotamian demigods. The land where Imaskari existed prior had been completely obliterated by the power of the demigods, and now was nothing more than just like a magically induced desert. So a massive immigration westward was warranted, especially since there was still Imaskari-controlled lands to the east, though it was also blocked off by mountains. Now, those lost Imaskari cities onto the east that never got destroyed in the war would later on become the first roots of the Asian-inspired continent of Karatur. But anyhow, both Mulhorand and Unther would become extremely powerful, as the God Kings would bring unparalleled prosperity and power to both kingdoms for millennia. They would fight amongst each other a bit at the beginning, but eventually would set a border between the two that both of them would be happy with and ally against their enemies from now on. Unther in particular would fight and absorb a massive section of Yandath on its western border, though 500 years later, Yandath would be able to restore those original borders. Unther would also eventually fight with the dwarves of the Great Rift to the south, but nothing would really come out of that encounter. Now, Mulhorand would actually invent ship technology as it would be known today. So the ships that you see nowadays whenever you play D&D, those were invented by Mulhorand at around the year minus 1500 DR. And those would allow dominion over the seas and further expansion for Mulhorand. Now, both Unther and Mulhorand would inevitably start conquering many of the lands to the north, albeit very slowly. The Star Elves from the Yurewood, which we talked about on our Half-Elf video, would fight with the humans a bit, but ultimately decide to abandon these lands instead, realizing that there's really no point in stopping the humans because they just reproduce way too fast and there's just too many. So the Star Elves open up portals and abandon Faerun like completely in exchange for a demiplane that runs concordant with the Yurewood, where they still live in there up until this day. The remaining elves of the forest intermingled with expanding humans, inevitably forming the half-elves that exist in nowadays Aglarand and the Yurewood. And in fact, the Yurewood is the largest concentration of half-elves in the world, and would end up becoming the racial capital, as it would be considered by many today. Anyhow, both Mulhorand and Unther would suffer a catastrophic war thanks to a wizard called Thade, who was known as one of the last apprentices to the powerful wizards of ancient Imaskari. He basically had knowledge of the rare technology of the Imaskari, in particular the portals that the Imaskari used in order to move across the empire, and also the portals that they used to enslave the Egyptian and Mesopotamian people from Earth. Technology that originally the Imaskari had taken from the original Batrachi back in the olden days, one of the creator races. Now, Thade was attempting to create civil strife in order to break down both kingdoms of Mulhorand and Unther, and he did so by constructing a massive portal, much like the ones that the Imaskari used to get to Earth, except that this one connected onto a world that was completely dominated by religious orc zealots. Thade was eventually killed, and with him the knowledge of the portal, which lay there basically unmolested, untouched for almost 5 years, just unseen and unfound. And through that time, those 5 years, hordes and hordes of orcs stormed through those magical gates and onto Faerun. Now, let's take a step back. Now we have two different kinds of orcs that may or may not come from the same planet. See, the original orcs that appeared tens of thousands of years ago, which were likely summoned forth through portals by the Batrachi, were summoned up in the mountains on the western, particularly north side of Faerun. These orcs are dumb, they are monstrous, and they're meant to look really like pigs. They would be the archetypal sort of like pig-like orc. They destroy everything in their path, they forcefully reproduce with other races against their will, and overall are just irredeemably evil. The half-orcs that you find on the western side of Faerun basically all come from the evil conquering and reproduction that comes from these orcs. Most of the orcs that you find in Dungeons & Dragons are technically meant to be these kinds of orcs. They are very powerful and have many holdings scattered up in the mountains, especially in the spine of the world where they come down every few hundred years in massive hordes to conquer and destroy. These orcs are generally called mountain orcs. Now, these new orcs that are just entering the world as of the year minus 1076 DR are called Grey Orcs. They are the ones that are portrayed in both the Monster Manual and in Volo's Guide to Monsters for 5th edition. They are a bit more civilized, they're a bit more intelligent, though, still below average, so below human intelligence, but they are more than anything highly religious, with very complex rituals and a whole deific pantheon. Well, the hordes of Grey Orcs came forth from the Great Portal in what today would be called Thay, though back then it was still controlled by Unther and Mulhorand, and so began the Orc Gate Wars. The orcs, as orcs do, completely destroyed everything and amassed enormous victories early on in the war. One of their greatest strengths was their divine magic, as they had highly accomplished clerics. I mean, like, really, their whole race was zealot in their veneration of Grumsh and its orcish pantheon. So much so, in fact, that in great rituals, they actually summoned powerful avatars of their orcish gods. Now, these avatars fought the god kings, the avatars of both the Egyptian and Mesopotamian gods, and it was a complete slaughter. We actually call this the Battle of the Gods. This battle happened in minus 1071 DR, so basically 5 years into the war. Re, the avatar of Ra and leader of the god kings of Mulhorand, perished in a fight against Grumsh, chief god of the orcs. As he died, he spread his power over to Horus, who would evolve into Horus Re, and would also spread his essence onto his army's weapons, who would then become orc-slaying weapons. Mulhorand's god kings, however, suffered the most, as Irana was killed by Bactru, Giru was killed by Luthik, Nurgle was killed by Ilnaval, Nana Sin was killed by Shargus, and Ki alongside Utu were killed as well by undisclosed orcish deities. Then, this might sound like a bit of a plot twist, but Tiamat showed up. See, veneration of Tiamat was brought up again in great numbers in Faerun thanks to the original Mesopotamian humans. Tiamat is a goddess of chaos and primordial creation in Mesopotamian religion, and so churches to Tiamat would inevitably spring forth in Unther throughout this time. This veneration must have brought Tiamat's attention back to Faerun after so many millennia, because it is also noted that during this time in particular, the Chromatics and Metallic Dragons fought a lot against each other. Marduk, a god king of Unther, represented an earth version of Bahamut, and so both of them would fight on and off throughout this time as well. In any case, during the Battle of the Gods, as Gilgium, one of the god kings of Unther, was fighting Ilnaval, an orcish god, Tiamat prepared a surprise attack to kill Gilgium, but it was intercepted by Marduk, who ended up sacrificing himself in order to kill Tiamat. All in all, just like an insane climactic war that turned the tide against the orcs, in particular thanks to the now orc-slaying blast that the soldiers had in their weapons, thanks to the sacrifice of Ra. Many Grey Orcs would be pushed back onto the portal, while many others would be slaughtered during the war. Some clans and groups of Grey Orcs did escape in the end, scattering across the eastern north side of Faerun in attempts to survive against the God Kings. And so nowadays, the Grey Orcs live either in very remote locations, far from civilization, or as nomads, who travel from place to place. These Grey Orcs would never really amount to much else, however, as the tribes that would survive would be no more than, say, 50 orcs per tribe, and being forced to live nomadic lives would never allow them to reproduce with the same fervor as their mountain cousins. Now, a huge factor that allowed for the defeat of the orcs were the large number of mercenaries that were hired from across the north. When the Orc Gate Wars ended and those mercenaries returned home, they would actually start making towns and cities which would form small kingdoms over time, and those kingdoms would inevitably grow into Narfell and Raumothar. These two have their own insane history. Narfell, which started as a collection of small kingdoms, would be all dominated by a powerful sorcerer who would unite them all into the kingdom of Narfell. Then he would attempt to invade Mulhorand and fail, only to then be invaded itself by the armies of Raumothar. The war between Narfell and Raumothar would be bloody and would last for around 500 years. The sorcerer that controlled Narfell at the time was a fervent follower of Orcus, and so he instilled upon his kingdom the veneration of demons, and through many demonic pacts, the people of Narfell would develop powerful sorcerer's powers themselves, as well as the ability to summon demons for the war. Raumothar, on the other hand, possessed knowledge taken from Imiskar, who they used in order to build portals and powerful golems. The battles would go back and forth as their kingdoms would be completely destroyed by the war, with each side becoming more and more desperate and resorting into more and more terrible actions. Narfell, for example, would summon the demon lord Kochchi alongside legions of frost giants. Raumothar would elicit the aid of white dragons, as well as their superior magic in order to not just counter, but push the fight deep into Narfell territory, forcing then Narfell to become more desperate and summon a demon lord called Eltab, who then brought with him countless legions of demons, which obliterated the armies of Raumothar. However, as demon lords do, Eltab decided that it was actually in his best interest to just do whatever the hell he wanted, and started then conquering lands for itself, as demons would spread out and fairly destroyed everything that they saw everywhere. Raumothar, in order to save their kingdom and destroy the demons, summoned an avatar of the elemental lord Koseth, in an event that would then be known as the Great Conflagration. Koseth would burn everything indiscriminately, destroying both armies and destroying both realms. In the end, both kingdoms basically lost everything. Raumothar would become the Endless Waste, as it is known today, with the entire kingdom basically just burned to ash. Many would escape to the east, with others that would congregate around this lake here in this small region that we called Rashomon. A group of powerful women called the Witches of Rashomon would then bring back order and maintain some of that lore that Raumothar had lost. They would imprison the demon lord Eltab and then help destroy the demons, at least in this very contained small area. Now, Narfell would retain nothing but its name, as demons would spread out across the region and basically pillage all they saw. The peoples of Narfell would devolve into barbarism, many eventually moving on to Damara and Vasa, which would be new regions that would open up centuries later once the ice caps here would melt. This land would be particularly notorious for producing tieflings, as many humans from Narfell would continuously reproduce or make deals with demons, whether throughout the Great War or after. Then at around this time, back down here, Giandeth would suffer from a tyrannical ruler that would oust the democracy of the kingdom and would take complete power. He would start attempting to conquer lands by ships, which would start fairly well, until the kingdom found itself in need of large quantities of wood. And so Giandeth would start taking wood from the elf forest of Nikerimath, slaughtering all the elves that opposed them. Enraged by this, the elves of the forest casted a powerful high magic spell that then sent massive waves of water from the Sea of Fallen Stars right onto the kingdom of Giandeth, effectively destroying most of its cities in one fell swoop, which of course precipitated the fall of that kingdom. The high magic spell was actually so powerful that this created a permanent enlargement of the Sea of Moving Stars, completely inundating most of the area in what is now known as the Bilahon Reach. So this place right here, it used to not have water before this calamity. Then, at the very end of the Age of Humanity, a group of followers who believed in the same mantra as Thade, the wizard who opened up the Orc Gate originally and wanted secession from the God Kings, called themselves the Red Wizards, as an homage to Thade, who used the red robes as a symbol of the original rebellion. These wizards, however, actually succeeded in the rebellion where Thade had originally failed. They ended up sacking the provincial capital of the region and even freed the demon lord Eltab to aid them, which he did. See, Eltab at the time had escaped imprisonment from the witches of Rashmed. He had gone berserk and done a few terrible things before he was again imprisoned right where Thaymount would be located, really right under it actually. But with the help of the Demon Lord, the Mulhorand armies were routed, which allowed for this region right here to then secede from Mulhorand, calling themselves Thay. They then imprisoned Eltab once again underground and then built their new capital city on top of his prison. Now, to end this video, let's talk about the elves as they appeared during the Age of Humanity. The elves of Nikerimath had a thriving realm, but then of course Yamdath started slaughtering them for their wood. It is actually said that 9 out of 10 elves were killed, and only one elvish city on that kingdom was left. Rusian Shan, which is the name of the city, lays hidden to this day with powerful magic. It was this culling of their people that forced the elves to seek retribution in the form of a high magic spell that, as we know, ended the kingdom of Yamdath. A spell which killed approximately 60,000 humans, which again, these numbers are just insane. However, the green elf kingdom of Nikerimath was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed after that calamity. Now, the Star Elves from the Yurewood, as we also covered, ended up abandoning Faerun in favor of a demiplane as the encroachment of humans threatened their way of life. Many Green Elves, after the terrible battles of the Crown War, seek to isolate themselves in the deepest forest of Faerun, frankly detaching themselves from Elvish culture, Elvish gods, and instead just living a peaceful, primitive life away from progress and away from magic. These Green Elves would eventually morph into the Wild Elves that we know today, who may still be found in many forgotten forests of the world, though to you guys they would basically seem as just barbarian elves. Notably, you can find them around these areas in the Condlewood, Forest of Amtar, Cholt, and Chizenta. Now, if you guys remember, the Elvish kingdom of Keltormir was completely destroyed by red dragons before it was taken by the genie Callum, before that Callum was disposed by humans and dwarves. Then we have the Elvish kingdom of Illifarm, which was the only other main survivor of the Crown Wars, outside of Keltormir of course, who ended up thriving at least until about minus 1110 DR. Even though they had held strong against the orcs of the Spine of the World, they saw that humans were quickly expanding into their territories and, much like the Star Elves, instead of fighting them, they simply decided to abandon their kingdoms in peace and then retreat onto Evermeet. They used powerful high magic to literally delete their cities so that no trace of them would be left, other than perhaps some leftover high magic that is very, very difficult to clear away. Humans would inevitably settle in that region where the capital was located, and the city of Waterdeep would be founded in there. And in fact, some of that residual high magic that the capital city of Illifarm used to have can still be felt to this day in Waterdeep. Now, some small groups of elves from the Illifarm Empire would stay, but in small sections of forest scattered across the north. Then we have the Elvish kingdom of Ristalwood that would struggle for the entirety of this era basically, as the Drow would be relentless in their pursuit of dominating parts of the world above ground. We talked about their terrible assaults on Calanshan, but their efforts were also spent attacking many of the elves of the Ristalwood. They erected a massive tower keep in the forest and fought the elves for over 2,000 years before an alliance of Cormanthor, Ristalwood, and Dark Elf followers of Elistrae managed to then finally push those Drow back onto the underground. However, a few centuries later, the orcs would come down in large numbers from the mountains, and without the Netherese to help them this time, they were overwhelmed, and the Ristalwood kingdom of elves were no more. Now, over here, the Elvish Kingdom of Ireland would actually last for a considerable amount of time, all the way actually until the year 882, so basically up until the end of this age. However, with many elves being eventually forced to fight orcs that had allied with demons, and then of course a severe weakening of the kingdom by elves that sought to leave in order to go back to Evermeet, the kingdom eventually fell to demonic hordes of orcs. The only true Elvish kingdom that would last past the age of humanity would be Cormanthier, also known as the Elvish Court. If you remember, this was the place where the Seldarine gathered during the Crown Wars in order to figure out who had been responsible for those wars. Since then, the place had become something of a religious and cultural center of Elvish society, and many of the elves who had lost their homes for one reason or another, if they decided against moving to Everesca or Evermeet, they would eventually end up here in Cormanthier. Now, Cormanthier was actually in a better geological position than many of its other Elvish kingdoms, as they did not have to contend with orcs in the same capacity as others, which allowed them to flourish peacefully for millennia. They fought the Drow with help of Ristlewood, but it was otherwise uncontested really mostly in its territory. Interestingly enough though, it also took a different approach towards humans than many of its cousins did. Whereas the Star Elves of the Yurewood and the entire kingdom of Illafarm had decided to simply abandon its lands rather than deal with the humans, Cormanthier instead decided to ingratiate itself with the humans, to work together with them as equals. Kinda like what Ireland had tried to do at the beginning with the Netherese wizards. As humans were spreading through the south, coming from civilized Calamshan, from the west, coming from the many barbarian tribes that arrived by boat from the sea, or from the north in the form of Netherese citizens seeking to escape the devastation of their kingdom, or from the east in the form of Yandath and the Untheric immigrants, or even citizens of Narfell seeking to run away from the demonic torn land, the elves made a deal with all of these humans because they were being surrounded by humans from every side imaginable, and they made a contract with them that would be called the Dale's Compact. This agreement stipulated that humans could settle in lands around Cormanthier so long as they settled in non-forested areas and areas not claimed by elves. And of course, so long as they did not cut down any forest governed by elves. Upon reaching this agreement with the human immigrants, a celebration was made and a massive standing stone was erected in its honor. Both the elves of Cormanthier and the humans, which would start founding the mini-kingdoms that nowadays we call the Dale Lands, decided then to commemorate this alliance further by starting a new calendar called the Dale Reckoning, which of course is the calendar that we have been using throughout this entire series of videos. So as you can already guess, this happened on the year 1 DR. The age of humanity, of course, would then stretch for another 1,000 years after this. In any case, this was definitely a tremendously momentous occasion in the history of the Forgotten Realms, as it signified for the first time as something of a real union between two different species. Because so far, we've had small alliances, right, between the dwarves and the humans, such as the dwarves of Shanatar and the humans from Calamshan, or the dwarves of Delzone and the humans of Netheril, but such alliances were there either for profit or were alliances of convenience that never truly lasted. These were not alliances of friendship and trust. And so in this case, we actually did have the very first union of friendship, and Cormanthier would become something of a cultural heaven for not just elves, but also humans, and halflings, and gnomes, and dwarves, and even some drow, as many races would intermingle within its great boughs for the next many centuries. Much culture would be exchanged between all of these different species and would be learned from one another, and thanks to the Dale's Compact and much of what would transpire in these forests, the beginning of what we now know as the present day would start flourishing, where different species could work together and well, just not kill each other. When you explore the present day of the Forgotten Realms and you travel through cities such as Mirabar or Waterdeep and encounter dwarves and gnomes and halflings, and you see them drinking together and working together, adventuring together, of course, all of that came down to this very moment of union and friendship. And of course, suffice it to say, this was also the birth of one of the most beloved and also populous species within the Forgotten Realms, the half-elf. So it makes sense why in the Forgotten Realms, the Dale Reckoning calendar would be used as a time-keeping mechanism between the different races and kingdoms, as it was, in a lot of ways, the real birth of interspecies relations in the world. But nothing good lasts in this world, however, as the Colonel, the leader of Cormanthier and the visionary that saw how important this union could be, died. No one was able to take its place, and the heir that was meant to replace him was assassinated by those who did not agree with letting other species within Elvish lands walk in them. Through a few centuries of political disagreements, demonic attacks, drow subterfuge, and humans overwhelmingly overpopulating the elves, the Elvish leadership finally decided that it was time for a great retreat towards Evermeet. But this would happen around 300 years after the era of humanity is over, though it was worth at least mentioning, I think. So that would happen basically around 1300 years after the Dale's Compact. I will also mention that one of the most powerful modern human kingdoms would form a few decades after the Dale's Compact, right under Cormanthier in the form of Cormyr, though there is really not much to really tell about it. But in any case, that's it. I am 13 pages onto this script, and we also had to do a whole video just dedicated for Nethril to be a companion video to this one. I did have to fast forward through some details, but I think that we basically got all of the major bits in here. But just another set of quick notes. In here, by Eastern Shore, it is believed that there existed what would have probably been the original kingdom of the gnomes. Perhaps, maybe where they originally appeared, evolved, or were created. The kingdom was called Olerhode, but it was said to have been absolutely annihilated by orcs. Apparently, the war between those gnomes and the orcs only lasted 10 days. They were just massacred. Then we have a kingdom of orcs that actually sprouted here called Vastar. It was awesome. These guys came from the north and destroyed the elves in here, and then settled as more and more orcs basically moved here as well. These guys lasted for about almost 1,000 years as like a true orc kingdom that would invade the lands of Cormanthier and even held a sizable chunk of their lands for many centuries. They would obliterate sections of Narfell, they would build ships and raid the Sea of Fallen Stars, they would fight alliances of humans and elves, and many times even win those battles. Maybe one day I will do a full video about this, guys. Many of the mountain orcs that became such a problem for so many civilizations here in the East actually came from these guys who reproduced aggressively from this kingdom and then spread out all across the southern portions of the world. They were eventually defeated though, thanks to the combined effort of humans, elves, and dwarves actually. Dwarves in particular did spend hundreds of years crafting orc-slaying magical weapons and then took the brunt of that war effort. The dwarves would actually take over this region for a while, but eventually would be destroyed again by other sets of orcs, only for then humans later on to simply reproduce their way into dominating the area as humans typically do. But yeah, that's it. That's the video. This video lives us in the year 1000 DR as we end the age of humanity and then would begin what is called the present era. We don't really have a name for this new era yet since, well, we're still on it. Though so far, this present era will be known as an era of magical cataclysms and grand shiftings of the world. The Dragonborn will start appearing in this new era, gods will start walking the planet again, and a new divine order will take place as an overlord of gods would finally make itself known. Now, I don't actually think that I will be making a video for this era actually, the present era. Maybe in the future, but I'm a bit burnt out, frankly, with the series. I just want to go back to talking about cool dragons for a while, and then after that, possibly return to the Outer Planes and cover the Nine Hells and a few other places that I've been meaning to return to, because that was a big series that we don't have completed either. But I hope you guys enjoyed the series. It was way too much research to do. The editing was particularly harder than my usual stuff, but I'm honestly glad I did it. it was a lot of fun. What is left now in the timeline is only about 500 or so years worth of history, but that history is really mostly all the adventures that have been released. Of course, all the novels, there's a lot of kingdom building that happens, and of course, all of the deity shenanigans that transpired in between the editions to mark the differences in editions. But there it is. That's the end of the video, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, please head on over to mrrex.store to check out some of the PDFs that I have made that will undoubtedly make your D&D experience so much better. This Forgotten Realms timeline series was a passion project of mine, and I figured it wasn't going to get as many views as some of my other stuff, but even still, it took way longer than expected, with some of these videos being just so long, of course including this one, which ended up being just over an hour long. It took me an entire week of editing just to get this video out. MrRex.store if you guys want to support the channel. I recommend What They Don't Tell You About Magic Items, where I price out most of the magic items of 5th edition, and then set up a way for DMs and players to easily purchase potions, poisons, weapons, and armor enhancements, and even create a way for spellcasters to craft their very own staffs. Please check it out. It's definitely my most popular PDF, and doing so would help me tremendously. Now, thank you all so much for just being the best community out there, and I will see you all next time.